Well, greetings and welcome to St. Paul's College here on the Fort Garry campus of the University of Manitoba, site of the 2015 McLuhan's Faith and Works Conference. And there's a funny story associated with how that conference came about. In 2014, in June of that year, I met up with Dr. Reed Schuchart of Wheaton College, also of the International Institute for the Study of Technology and Christianity, and we met up at toward the end of the convention of the Media Ecology Association that year, which was held at the Ryerson University in Toronto. And the same occasion I met Jared Cole, who's the producer of this film, and he approached me and said, "You know, Howard, what would you say if we went together in on a conference?" And I jumped at the chance. We happened to be on our pilgrimage to the various McLuhan sites like St. Basil's Church, the Coach House, of course, Witchwood Park, which is where he lived when he died, and then also the cemetery where he's now buried. This is when he proposed this idea, and I thought it was a really good one. So we collaborated on that for the next year and a half almost. And really worked well. They came up, he brought a contingent of students up from Wheaton College, and we had people from all over North America, and even a speaker from New Zealand, Andrew Crystal. And we were really blessed and very glad to be able to host such an auspicious event at this conference, which celebrated two things that we try to do in the initiative, and that is to draw attention to McLuhan's prairie roots, you know, where the Westerner, as he described in his book, Speaking of Winnipeg, the Westerner has a vast panorama, not a point of view, and also his Catholic faith. One can draw a direct connection from the time he obtained a copy of G.K. Chesterson's book, What's Wrong with the World. So we were very pleased to have been here with this, and we hope this will be just the beginning of future collaborations with many people who are also interested in Marshall McLuhan. And here we are in Marshall McLuhan Hall. That was dedicated in June 2004 to recognize a very prominent alumnus of the University of Manitoba who graduated here in 1933 with a Bachelor of Arts in English and Philosophy with a gold medal, and no less, and then the following year with a Master of Arts as well with a thesis on George Meredith. And it was very interesting when this hall was dedicated. Of course, a number of his descendants came. Eric, the eldest son, and I think a couple of the daughters were here as well. And Eric pointed out in his inimitable way, McLuhan-esque way, you know, he inherited that from his dad, I'm sure, just said, well, this is one of the only dedications where his mother's side was also recognized at the same time, because Marshall McLuhan Hall, Elsie Hall was Marshall's mother's maiden name, so Hall. So that was kind of neat. So Marshall, as I mentioned, he had all his schooling here. We were able to a few years ago when Calvin High School, where he attended in the late 20s, celebrated its centenary, and we were able to pick up here at the initiative. We were able to pick up a couple of artifacts from their yearbook. This is Calvin Technical High School, it was known as at the time. It was a different building, of course. The building that we know today was built in the 60s. This is what it looked like way back in the time when Marshall attended. Marshall was a distinguished student while he was here. He grew up actually mostly in Winnipeg. The family moved from Edmonton in 1915. So he's only 4 years old at the time, so he had not yet started school. So he did all of his primary and secondary education here and started his post-secondary education right here in Winnipeg. He was here for the better part of 20 years, almost 20 years, 19 years. When he graduated, as I mentioned earlier, from his BA in a Bachelor of Arts in English and Philosophy. This is Marshall right here, with honors. In fact, he earned the gold medal for Arts and Science that year. And then the following year, he earned his Master of Arts as well. He had a thesis on George Meredith. And he moved on then from there to Cambridge and so on. And he left behind quite the legacy that we would like to celebrate. And we have a lot to celebrate for that. In Winnipeg, we mentioned one of the things, because he had so much of his formation here, one of the neat things that happened while he was here, while he was a student at the University of Manitoba, he had a very good friend by the name of Tom Easterbrook, who was later became a professor of economic history at U of T as well. So they became colleagues later on. But they were chums here, student chums here. And they happened to be visiting this used bookstore in Winnipeg one day, and they each picked up a book and discovered that the book that they had was not of interest to them, but the one that the other bought was of more interest. And in this case, for Marshall, it was What's Wrong with the World by G.K. Chesterton. And it was published originally in 1910.
Chesterton is interesting because McLuhan and his buddy Tom Easterbrook went to, I believe it was 1932, and they had about a year or so left of U of M. And Tom's in engineering, and I think Marshall was first year English, but previously had been in engineering. Like he met Tom as a result of them both being in engineering. And depending on who you talk to, it's 1 or 2 years. But I mean, I'm not at baseball. I don't care about like splitting hairs on whether he took 1 year of engineering or 2 years of engineering. The point is, he began in engineering, met Easterbrook, then switched over to literature as his major and English arts as his major. By the way, all this occurred at the Broadway campus, where the memorial fountains are now. There was an engineering building, so a science building, and an arts building, and I think a couple theaters and a junior college. It was like there was a campus there. And so they decided they were going to go to Europe. It was 32, and they took a trip there on a cattle boat. And one of the books that they got before they left Winnipeg was McLuhan got a book by a guy named L.L. I forget his last name. He was an economist. And then Easterbrook got Chesterton's What's Wrong with the World. And he said to McLuhan, "You'll like this, I hate it." And McLuhan and Easterbrook both say that book is a slim volume of the satirical writings of the controversial Catholic writer Gilbert Keith Chesterton. And so he's controversial for a variety of reasons that basically everybody was controversial. I'll leave it at that. Everybody was controversial in the West for a while, and then they stopped being controversial towards the end of the 40s. Anyways, he was among them. McLuhan called him a practical mystic. That's in fact the name of his first published essay. Is called G.K. Chesterton, Practical Mystic. And what he means by that is anybody who studies the hidden environment is ostensibly a mystic. So if you see these people with their phones all the time and then talking about how they have their phones all the time, that's like pre-nursery level practical mystic. So it's good, but pre-nursery. So much talent is always percolating in Winnipeg. We just, as Winnipeggers, take it for granted, like that song, "We Were Born Here, What's Your Excuse?" But it's not really even, it's not a negative. Like, there's just something about, I guess, just being in the middle of North America that is conducive to, conversation, because there's so much more thought going on here. I think I can't go into all the reasons because I don't know, but I would imagine being able to see all the way down to where there's no obstruction is a good environment to take an idea and see the limits of that idea and maybe do it. Won't be easy, but at least you'll have that idea, you'll have that hypothetical defined here more so than, let's say, in other more densely populated areas. The ease of just looking straight forward is just easier to do here. In other areas, you may have to look all different directions to get that same length of unobstructed thought to surrounding ratio. And I think like that's why Winnipeg's important, because you have those things. And at 2017, if we were going to be gentrified, we would be uselessly gentrified. But it's too hard to monetize Winnipeg, and that's what's great about Winnipeg. Because just when you think it's easy, it's minus 60, someone gets lost and dies because they didn't realize how fucking crazy it was when it was minus 60. Because they were just being casual, like they've been in other places that have public transport. So many places, there's a place you can walk in, but what happens when there's nowhere, nothing, for miles, and you just fucking die? Not to be morbid, but Winnipeg forces you to look both ways. Maybe all the way around, like a vortex. Vortex, the internet, acoustic space, Carl Williams, Winnipeg. You know, he became a psychologist. He studied under E.A. Bott out of Chicago, who was the person that was like, what silence is to sound, that's what acoustic space is. Center everywhere, margin nowhere, the Neoplatonic definition of God. These are the kinds of things that become casual, normal things if you stay in Winnipeg long enough. You don't maybe articulate it that way, but you feel it, and that's what's good about Winnipeg.
Take a breather. Hello, my name is Tom Kohut, and I'm a new media critic, art critic, and curator here in Winnipeg, and co-editor, along with my friend and colleague Milenti Pendelovsky, co-editor of the book Marshall McLuhan and Willem Flusser's Communication and Aesthetic Theories Revisited. Here I am. It's very rarely one single event that sort of, you know, the claps of thunder, as it were, don't happen that way. It tends to be part of I think there has been, overall, not just in Manitoba, but I think in North America and globally, another resurgence of interest in the work of Marshall McLuhan, which tends to have its ebbs and flows. It never entirely goes away, but it certainly ebbs and flows, and you can usually tell this by looking at publications of Understanding Media, the book that he initially published back in the early 60s, I believe, which will go kind of out of print, and then suddenly a brand new edition will come out, and you can usually that's because there's some new technological development, and everybody starts going to this, not quite the source of communication theory or media theory, but certainly an important synthesizer and developer of those ideas. I know that the McLuhan Center at the University of Manitoba doesn't have particularly wonderful funding, or it has very minimal funding. I think it's strictly through the college that it's out of, but I'm not 100% sure about that. But I do know that it's, you know, it does what it does on the goodwill of the people involved, certainly. I know that the Gertrude House doesn't have a blue plaque on it, but some fairly people that you've never heard of seem to have their houses, listed. So do I think? Yeah, I think Winnipeg has forgotten Marshall McLuhan, in large part because he is and that's not entirely Winnipeg's fault, to be fair. I mean, yes, he did his childhood here. Well, he grew up here, rather. He didn't do his childhood here. He grew up here. His first, academic studies were at the University of Manitoba. But he isn't conspicuous in sort of saying that he's, this sort of great prairie guy, Winnipeg boy sort of thing that people do more so now. And he's more associated with Toronto, and he associated himself more with Toronto, so it's sort of a mutual anamnesis, perhaps.
I guess you can just tell us about the house and...
Well, this is the house. I don't know whether I should give the full address. I mean, I guess it's well known. It's 507 Gertrude Avenue. And this is where Marshall McLuhan and his family and his brother and parents moved here from Edmonton in the early part of the 20th century. And this is where he spent apparently a very serious-minded youth. Apparently he didn't want to read Paradise Lost by John Milton too early, lest he, because he said he wouldn't be worthy of it yet. So this was the sort of serious man that he was. His mother was an actress, and yes, this was, I think, the McLuhans were sort of upwardly mobile, and at the time Winnipeg was a good place for the upwardly mobile to live. So, and then when he got the chance to, he moved to Cambridge and never came back.
Well, who Marshall McLuhan is really depends on who you are, I think. So it's quite a broad question to ask. And certainly it depends on your perspective to begin with, on how willing and open you are to explore media as environments rather than as things that control you or whatever. So it really depends on who you are. And for some people, he's this, great media pundit. For some people, he's a prophet. For some people, he is simply the name of a bizarre person of the past. But for many more people, he's a kind of guiding light, as it were, in terms of discovering one's own praxis in relation to media, and also in terms of understanding media. It is the medium that is the environment that we need to be concerned about, not so much the content of the medium itself. So really understanding that there's figure and ground, content and medium, and the medium itself is the thing that is indicating to us how we are changing as people and as societies. The Coach House is an interesting entity that has had a long and varied life. You can just see it by the name of it itself. But it's kind of, if you will, you could look at it in the coach metaphor and say that it's a kind of hub, the center of a wheel. And it's a gathering place. It's a place that has had more and less involvement with an academic kind of engagement with regard to McLuhan. And now it's kind of I think it's a forum, it's a hub, it's a place of interaction internationally, but also locally with St. Michael's College, the Book and Media Studies program, and the University of Toronto. Bringing together, I think, not only enthusiasts of McLuhan and not only people who remember him, giving Monday night seminars in that location, but also in terms of the people who are trying to look at his legacy, look at his essentially his archival self, and kind of bring McLuhan studies forward. So it's interesting that great figures of communication history coming out of Canada, people like Marshall McLuhan, Harold Innes, and I think there's a desire for Canadians to understand who they were as Canadians and in juxtaposition with the study of communication. And so there is a kind of mythos that's been created, and I think that we have absorbed ourselves as Canadians regarding our relationship to communication because of things like, Douglas Copeland and others have pointed out, long distances, harsh winters, essentially as Margaret Atwood would say, a kind of survival kind of environment. And this is who we are. And so it seems that there's something about us that's inherent in us because we're a nation that is so much created upon not only the commercialization of communication, as Haroldin has pointed out in the fur trade in Canada, but also just in terms of the logistics of who we are and how we can get together with one another. And you know, there have been a lot of suggestions about McLuhan being from the prairies, and you know, this sort of vast openness, this iconic, if you will, landscape, the medieval landscape of the illuminated manuscript versus the print cultural landscape of truncation and shorter horizons that you might find in a place like Southern Ontario. So is there something in that in terms of his formation? We can only speculate, but it is kind of suggestive that we keep coming to the same sorts of suggestions where it concerns McLuhan and ourselves as communicative beings in this country.
Good.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I'm definitely getting more fluent and fluid as we go on, but anyway.
Yeah, I think
Are we
we're definitely
are we a wrap?
That's where
Okay.